"So you're just going to come up and not stop?" the man shouted, full of drunken, self-righteous anger. He stood right in the middle of the sidewalk, preventing the royal guards from continuing their march. The leader of the guards stopped for a moment, his gaze coldly fixing the intruder. "I'm sorry, but you have to go to the other side." His voice was calm and professional, but the shared silence between them was so tense that you could feel his words were heavier than stone. "I'm not moving," the man frowned, despite the fact that everything around him pointed to the contrary. He stood there, stubborn, approaching the red uniform of the guardsman, not even noticing how he was increasingly attracting the attention of the crowd. The younger man drinking in one of London's capital cities was no ordinary tourist. He was Mark Wilkinson, a former banker who, after several failed investments, was paying for his ambitions in the most shameful way. He was a man who, although he had money, often felt that the system was against him. And this time, he decided to face what he imagined to be his greatest enemy, the guard that had always remained unmoved. But what happened next? Mark Wilkinson stood on the last front line, surrounded by thousands of eyes watching his every move. Drunk, confused by his own emotions, he looked at the approaching royal guards with a sense of great contempt. It was more than just a dislike of these brave men in red uniforms and tall hats. It was a protest against everything they represented: unbreakable, disciplined, and stuck in their ways. He knew that the changing of the guard was a ritual that an entire generation obeyed, and it all reminded him of his own defeat. He was just another forgotten businessman who failed to break through the wall of the system. His attempts to become part of the elite had failed, and his current life had become an empty shelf filled with alcohol and losses. Free from shame, he decided to express his attitude to this grand show. Only this time it was not simple disrespect. It was a challenge. As soon as Mark saw the guardsmen approaching, his first impulse was to stop them. He walked right into the center of the sidewalk, deliberately standing directly in their path. The guardsmen's eyes remained fixed, but Mark could feel their cold indifference to what he was doing. The crowd began to stir, some trying to move away, others staring at this man who seemed ready to become a symbol of their protest. The leader of the guards took a short, decisive step forward and addressed Mark, his voice calm, even stern. "Please clear the way. You are interfering with the performance of duty." These were not just words. It was an order coming from the depths of a centuries-old tradition where there was no room for talk or compromise. Mark laughed, his laughter sounding like the sound of glass breaking. "You want me to leave? Well, I'm not moving until you tell me I'm important." He spoke louder, getting drunker with each word. His words sounded like he was at the center of the world, and all these guardsmen were just part of a theater that could be interrupted. Mark was not going to back down, even when he had already been warned. He stood with his legs wide apart, leaning on his knee, which was on the verge of falling over due to the excessive amount of alcohol he had consumed. His shoes, which had once sparkled with the shine of an expensive brand, were now stained with the dirty reality of the street. The man tried to gather his strength again, trying to forget about the pain coming from his head, as if holding everything on the edge. He looked at the guardsmen with a terrible stubbornness, preparing for what was to come. But as the guardsmen approached him, the leader's gaze was no longer so indifferent. He noticed Mark's movements, his frown, and paused for just a moment, considering his options. He addressed the man again, but this time his voice was hard and even, with a touch of inner authority. "I'm warning you for the last time. This is not your place. Step aside." The word "step back" sounded like an order, not a request, and everyone present heard the seriousness of the situation. Mark realized that he was already being heard. He tried to convince himself that his actions were more than just a protest, but this moment would not have been so important without a certain dose of delusion. The look in the guardsman's eyes was such that he literally understood. There was no doubt that this brave soldier would make no other decision but to go ahead. Mark took one more step, the step that would be the last step in his decision. He straightened his shoulders and turned to the guardsman as if to fight. "What now? What will you do if I don't back down?" His words fell out, and although they seemed defiant, his whole appearance was more weak than brave. By the time the guard reacted, Mark had already lost control of the situation. He didn't have a plan. He just wanted to respond to the challenge he had thrown. But he did not know that this game with the wall cannot be won when its strength is the wall itself. Mark stood there, ignoring the shouts of the crowd, who could already sense that the situation was becoming dangerous. His eyes were drunk and confused, but he held his ground. The guard looked up again and assessed the man in front of him. The distance between them was decreasing, and now it was clear he would not back down, and neither would the guard. One more step, and the red uniform would stop in front of him. The guardsman at the head of the formation had no intention of changing his steps for this man. Decades of service, many marches on London sidewalks, and dozens of similar challenges had shaped his discipline. He had seen worse situations. And although his heart was beating to the beat of the drums, he was sure that in his life this moment meant nothing more than a small misunderstanding. "I warned you." The guardsman's voice was calm, almost bored, but underlying it was iron authority. He turned and gave a short nod to his comrades. The rest of the formation moved in sync. Everyone was ready to go through any obstacle. Mark could feel his heart speeding up. The situation he had created for himself was starting to get out of hand. This look, the look of a man who had trained for a long time not to give in to provocation, a look that seemed to recognize fear, anger, and despair in his every move, left him no choice. "I'm not moving until you stop," he said, his voice not as confident as it had been a few minutes ago. He didn't know what would happen next, but the feeling had already matured in his mind that this was his last opportunity to do something meaningful. The guard stopped again, his gaze falling on Mark again, as if assessing his movements, checking to see if he was about to take any action that could jeopardize his safety. And then, without warning, Mark stepped forward. In doing so, he broke all the rules that existed between them. There was no force in this step, but it was decisive. The step was poorly coordinated, poorly thought out, and all of this was an instant signal to the guardsman. He did not waste time on another warning. The leader of the guards realized that it was time to act. He turned toward Mark without hesitation, taking a decisive step forward, a step that threw off any thought of compromise. Mark realized this only at the moment when he first heard the stupas more clearly than ever. He clenched his fists, his eyes widened, and thoughts of powerlessness began to swirl in his head again. He felt like he was about to take control of the situation, but his assertion of inviolability was only shattered by the guardsman's perfect order. He won't go back, he won't stop. His thoughts were running wild. Mark could not control himself, but it seemed to him that one more step forward and everything would be over. It would be his big moment. Then he hit the back again, getting ahead of himself. But instead of getting his victory, he heard something unforgettable, the sound of a clear step that did not change anything in their discipline. Mark finally realized that he had made a mistake. When Mark pushed the guardsman, he felt only a moment when his actions came together with a hard, cold reality. For a moment, everything around him seemed to freeze. His hands could not believe that it was over as quickly as it had begun. He felt his punch almost knock the guardsman off balance, and even he thought that this moment should have been decisive. But it was nothing of the sort. The guard did not stop. The punch Mark threw looked like an attempt that had no force against a huge machine moving on a stubborn road. The guardsman was only slightly deflected, and after a few moments his posture was completely stable again, as if he had not even noticed the push. "Did you understand?" thought Mark, but it was too late. His drunken hands felt only the heavy impact of his own, and a rigid, incredibly disciplined formation appeared before his eyes again. It was moving forward, ignoring his presence, like a wave that does not pay attention to the stone in its path. Mark tried to keep his balance, but it was getting harder and harder for him to stand. He felt as if his consciousness was slowly melting away, and his nerves, still trying to hold back his frustration, could not withstand the cruel reality. And then he saw it, footsteps, a rhythm, how the guardsmen were resuming their perfect gait, how they did not shift. The way their boots, heavy, precise, synchronized, went through his best suit. And then, like the dawn after a dark night, Mark realized his mistake. The guardsman, the leader of the formation, not only regained his balance, he sprang into action. The guardsman's first step, his foot, calmly but with incredible force, hit Mark's shoulders. It was not a blow. It was an inexorable advance. The push from him was such that Mark could not keep his balance and fell to his knees. He tried to get up, but he couldn't. His legs gave out. And then, without stopping his march, the guardsman took another step, and the next, and the next. The whole formation continued on its way, their feet rhythmically clattering on the stones. Mark felt his back being covered by heavy footsteps, one after another. At first, they were soft blows that he didn't even notice. But then, when the last guard passed and left his mark, it was not only physical prints, but also his own humiliation. His suit was now torn, his shoes were marked with mud, and there were clear marks of red boots on his shoulders. He lay on the stones, unable to get up. His face was sweaty and red from alcohol and shame. The crowd was silent as everyone witnessed this defeat. Mark tried to get up, but he failed. He sank back down, with a serious expression on his face, admitting to himself his mistake. He didn't even try to get up. It was pointless. All he had to do was lie there and watch his ambitions, his attempts to prove his strength, vanish into thin air, leaving only this difficult and inevitable path of the guardsmen. Those who witnessed this incident stood in silence, each thinking their own thing. And Mark, closing his eyes, felt his pride being smashed to pieces. There were no loud blows, no criticism, just the quiet determination of tradition. There have always been stronger than you, he thought, watching the last guard leave. He was just another small object they passed through to fulfill their mission. Silence. And everything fell into place.